Okay, so now we are back at the Gemara in the Mishnah, bottom of Kuf Tezayin with Aleph, bottom of 116a, second to last line, last word. So the Gemara is taking us through the order of the Seder nights. And again, we started all the way back from the beginning. We started with Erev Pesach, making sure you have an appetite, making sure your table is set, making sure you got your 4 cups of wine. And we went through the Seder night, we went through Kiddush, all the details of the Kiddush. We went through the washing, we went through the dipping, we went through the Charaises, we went through setting the Kaida, we went through everything. And now our second cup is full, as per the last Mishnah's instruction to fill the second cup of wine. The kid asked the questions, and we answered the questions. We answered them. The Mishnah didn't give us a text. We learned this. The Mishnah and the Gemara assumes you already know the text. It just tells you, here's the outline, which was 2 things. Number 1, your answer to the kid's 4 questions has to be in such a manner where you begin in shame and conclude with glory, with praise. The Gemara gives 2 versions to that. Those 2 versions are expressed in the paragraph which begins with the word Avodah Mayinu in our Seder, and the paragraph which begins Mitzchilo Odem Edazara. Those are the 2: slavery to freedom or idol worship to serving God. 2 paragraphs in Haggadah. And the Mishnah instructed us to take the words of the verse, which begin with the words Aram Yo'eved Avi, which is a text that the Torah prescribes for one who's carrying his bikurim up to the temple. He's bringing his first fruit to the temple. And the Torah says when you get there, you should give a whole history of how we got to the land of Israel, beginning with Yaakov struggling with Lavan and the children of Israel going down to Mitzrayim, getting stuck there. God took us out, brought us to Egypt, brought us to Israel. Thank you very much. And here's the fruit. And you put it down by the temple. Right? So it says that in Mishnah. Read those verses and expound upon them. So these 3 items, the 2 versions of how to begin with shame and end in glory, and the expounding on these verses, make up the bulk of the Haggadah, or the essence of the Haggadah, which we learned from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the essential paragraphs that one has to read. All the other stuff, the Dayenus, and the Alachas Kama V'Kama, and other paragraphs, the whole description about how many plagues there were at the sea, all of that is additions, because as the Haggadah itself instructs, whoever wants to elaborate, the more the merrier, add. So it's been added, and much has been added. Now the Mishnah is going to take us to the end of Magid, the end of the recitation of Haggadah, and as the Rebbe says it in Likutei Sichos, having gone through the entire story, the Mishnah, and therefore the Haggadah, now instructs us to recap the essence of the story. That's what the Mishnah is about to tell us to do. The essence that has to be recapped at the end. And then from there, we go to reciting the Hallel, reciting praise of Hashem, the Hallel, which is another obligation of the Seder night to say the Hallel. And the Hallel, as we're going to learn, is split. We see the first half of Hallel now at Magid, having concluded the story, having recapped the essence of the story, as we're about to learn. And then we read the beginning of Hallel. We break for the eating of maror, matzah, maror, sandwich, meal, bench, and then the rest of Hallel on the 3rd cup of wine. So this is the order that the Mishnah is about to lay out for us. So let's see. Last word on the second to last line of Kuf Zayin with Aleph 116a. Rabbi Gamliel used to say, it's an interesting phrasing. It doesn't say Rabbi Gamliel said.
Sorry, what page?
Kuf Tezayin with Aleph 116a, last word on the second to last line. Mishnah says, Rabbi Gamliel used to say, or would say, which is a funny phrasing. Why not just say Rabbi Gamliel says? Rabbi Gamliel Omer. As the Mishnah always does. Rather, Rabbi Gamliel would say. It sounds like it's something he would say every year. It's not an opinion. It's something he would recurringly do. It's an interesting way of putting it. And this entire text, as you might be familiar, is lifted and printed right in our Haggadah. Rabbi Gamliel would say, Kol shaloi amar shloisha, top of Kuf Yud Zayin with Aleph, Kuf Zayin with Beis, 116b. Kol shaloi amar shloisha dvarim elu. Anyone who has not said these 3 things, the Pesach on Pesach, La yatzai dechevasai has not fulfilled his obligation. If you don't say the following three things, you have not fulfilled your obligation. What are the three things? The Elohein, and they are as follows: Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. If you don't say those three things, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. The Mishnah now is going to go on to explain that you have to elaborate on those three things. Pesach, explain what it is. Matzah, explain what it is. Maror, explain what it is. My grandfather used to do this to his children, and therefore my mother used to do this to us. Even if we were little kids and we were going to sleep missing the Haggadah, missing the Seder, my grandfather would say with me, Pesach, Matzah, Maror. You have to say these three things. Get the essential mitzvah. So this is a thing. My mother passed it on to us.
Corresponds to Abraham, Isaac, Yaakov.
Yeah.
Huh?
Maybe. So Pesach, Matzah, Maror, those are the three things. Now, let me ask you. The Mishnah says, anyone who doesn't, Rabbi Gamliel would say, anyone who doesn't say these three things, Pesach, Matzah, Maror, hasn't fulfilled his obligation. Which obligation? Which obligation haven't you fulfilled if you didn't say Pesach, Matzah, and Maror? No?
Because this is the exactly
Which obligation do you have?
If you don't say that, this is the center of the festivity.
So which obligation have you failed if you didn't say Pesach, Matzah, Maror? Which obligation?
I would think the recitation.
Oh,
What?
the obligation to recite the story. That's the simplest explanation. It's the simplest meaning. If you haven't said these three things, you haven't fulfilled your obligation to tell the story. That's the simplest way to understand it. Where's my Rashbam and Rashi?
You have to recite all the story during this prayer. If you don't have time, when are you going to do it?
Make time.
Make time.
So if you don't say these three things, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. And you are correct. First of all, Rashbam says it's not just to say the words Pesach, Matzah, Maror as my grandfather used to, but actually to explain them. But anyway, be that as may. But you're correct. Most commentaries, including the Rebbe and his Haggadah, concur that the obligation in question here is the obligation to tell the story. In order to properly fulfill the obligation to tell a story, you must cover these three items: Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Yeah. Okay.
Many people is missing this.
However, there is one opinion, and if my memory serves me correctly, it's the Ran. I did a video on it once with all the sources. It's on YouTube somewhere. All the sources are there. There's at least one opinion which says, I think it's the Ran, if I remember correctly, that actually the obligation in question here is the obligation of Pesach, the obligation of Matzah, and the obligation of Maror. Meaning, if you want to fulfill the mitzvah of Maror properly, you have to recite and tell what the Maror is about. If you want to fulfill the mitzvah of Matzah properly, you have to say what Matzah is about. Which means, according to that opinion, Rabbi Gamliel is saying, if you ate Matzah and didn't describe what Matzah remembers, you didn't fulfill your obligation of Matzah. Mind-blowing.
The bread of Ani, no?
So if you don't explain, we'll see in a second. If you don't explain what the meaning of Maror is, you haven't fulfilled your obligation of Maror. And if you haven't explained what Pesach is, the Pesach offering, even though you ate the Pesach offering, you will have not fulfilled your obligation of Pesach. There's one opinion which says that. Which means, according to that opinion, when we explain at our Seder what the Pesach is about, we are fulfilling the maximum we can do of, not the mitzvah of telling the story, but of the mitzvah to eat Pesach, even though we have no Pesach left.
I would think so.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So you're right. The dominant opinion is, and that says it's in Haggadah, that if you don't, that the obligation question here is the obligation to tell the story. And in order to fulfill the obligation of telling the story, you have to say these three things. That's the main opinion. But there's a minority opinion which says that the obligation in question here is the obligation of eating Pesach, the obligation of eating matzah, and the obligation of eating maror. And those obligations require you to tell the story of what they are.
I would think
It's mitzvah sidiyah, the mitzvah of knowledge associated with the mitzvah itself. I just want to conclude before you make the comment. Not all mitzvahs require knowledge. For example, you don't have to know what the tefillin symbolizes. You put the tefillin on, you fulfill your obligation. You should know what the symbolism is. And the Shulchan Aruch tells you to meditate on certain things when you put on your tefillin. But if you didn't, you still fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillin. There are other mitzvahs where the Torah itself says you have to know. For example, The classic example is sukkah.
Mhm.
The pasuk says, "L'man yedu dayasechem," make the sukkah so your generation shall know
That you were.
that I sat you in huts when you traveled in the desert. The pasuk says so explicitly. So the pasuk explicitly associates the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah with knowledge, and there are halachas that are associated with this. For example, the sukkah may not be too high, because the schach is too high. You're not seeing it. You don't know. You have to know it's there.
Mhm.
So he says this minority opinion. The same thing is true of marar, matzah, and Pesach. Eating those things require your knowledge about them, and therefore, says Rabbi Gamliel, in order to fulfill the obligation of eating these things, according to this minority opinion, you have to discuss it and explain it. Again, this is a minority because the majority learn, as you said correctly, that the obligation in question here is to tell the story. That in order to tell the story properly, you will only fulfill the obligation of telling the story when you cover these three things. So there's two obligations that might be in question here. Yeah, what do you want to say?
And, just in an argument against that minority opinion would be that if that were the case, that where you had to have knowledge of these things in order to fulfill the mitzvah, then that knowledge should precede the blessings that are made on those mitzvahs.
They are.
Huh?
They are.
So then,
This comes at the end.
So then you automatically fulfill.
That's right. They are. That's what he's saying. You have to discuss these things before you. This is at the end of
So-
Magid.
so-
So before you eat matzah, before you've eaten Pesach, before you've eaten matzah.
Okay, I mean, so he's saying it there, but it happens sort of automatically anyway.
If you say them, it happens automatically when you say them. Which is what he's saying. It's a minority opinion, but it's still an interesting one to note. Yeah, clear. Okay.
My grandmother, she said to me on Pesach that you have to say, this is the way that the Lord split the sea in 12 paths of fish.
Yeah, that's not mentioned in the Haggadah.
No?
No, not to my knowledge.
My grandmother, she said to me that.
Okay, good. Very good. Sorry? It's on Shvisha Pesach, but I don't think it's mentioned in the Haggadah. The splitting of the sea is mentioned in the Haggadah, but I don't think it's. 1 second. We mentioned the splitting of the sea in the Haggadah, but I'm not sure if we mentioned the 12 passages, but it could be in there. I don't think it's in the Haggadah.
Well,
Okay, good. Yeah, very good. It's okay, but it's not connected to what we're learning now.
No, but
And
when you say the break.
But I want to focus on what we're
when
learning
you
now.
break-
Yeah.
No, I'm talking when you break
Right,
the
right.
matzah.
It's not mentioned there, but again, let's focus on what we're learning now.
Okay.
Okay. So now let's conclude. The Haggadah now tells us, the Mishnah now tells us, which is again quoted in the Haggadah, what the three things are. Pesach, al shum. The Pesach is second line, third to last word on top of Kuf Tezayin of Bay 116b. Pesach al shum shepasach al makam abotav eseinu. The Pesach offering is there, symbolizing the fact that Hashem Pasach, he jumped over the homes of our forefathers in Egypt when God was smiting the firstborn. The Jewish people were instructed to prepare a lamb offering, and then they painted the doorpost blood, and God jumped over. Shneimar, as the verse reads, and you shall say that this is a Pesach offering because Hashem jumped over. Again, that word Pesach. That's the first item. Second item, matzah. Symbolizing the fact that our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt. Shneimar, as the verse reads, the Jews baked the matzah that they took out of Egypt, and they made it ugois matzahs. They made it matzah bread as they ran out of Egypt. So the matzah symbolizes that moment. And then lastly, marar, the marar, the bitter, because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our forefathers in Egypt. As the verse reads, they embittered their lives, etc. Okay. We're going to pause over here, but I just want to note that what's interesting is the Haggadah just tells you directly, I'm saying the Mishnah just tells you directly, say these three things, Pesach, Matzah, Marah, and then explains what they are. Pesach, because God jumped over. Matzah, because we ran out of Egypt with bread. Marah, because they embittered our lives. Our Haggadahs have it a little bit more elaborate. Namely, Pesach, al Shumah. The Pesach, what is it for? Al Shum, it is for. So it's, the Haggadah has these items, but phrased in question answer. Beginning with Pesach, what's it for? Because God jumped over. Matzah, what's it for? Because we left Egypt in haste. So our Haggadah is a little bit more elaborate. Here it's a little bit more succinct. And when we get to Rebbe's Haggadah, we will see a little bit more about that as well.
Why do they say jumped over? It doesn't jump.
Good question. What that means, passed over.
Because it says
Passed over.
I'm gonna pass over the homes.
Yeah, it's a good question. What that means, what is it's all obviously it's all metaphysical and all anthropomorphic. It's not to be taken literally. God doesn't have a body that jumps. God forbid.
Here's a lot of the things.
It symbolizes a certain level of divine revelation that's associated with jumping. In very brief, because I don't want to take too much time on this, so our focus is halacha here. The judge is not here, but the judge likes when we incorporate a little chassidus and a little mysticism into the halacha. So we can maybe elaborate just for 2 minutes. So basically, this means like this. There's a level of divine which transcends our reality. When you say transcend, that means all of our reality is completely irrelevant and all the same. From that perspective, Jew, non-Jew, righteous, not righteous, what's the difference? God transcends. So what's the difference? So when God redeems the people, he's redeeming the people, or God's revealing to his people, the Jewish people, his divine transcendence. And as far as transcendence goes, as the Medrash says it, these people are idol worshippers, they're idol worshippers, they're all the same. So the fact that the divine transcendence chooses to distinguish between the Jew and the non-Jew, that's a great miracle.
That's right.
Because as far as transcendence is concerned, everybody should be the same. So this is the level of Pesach. Pesach, when Hashem jumps over, Pesach itself is like leaps and bounds, indicates the infinite, indicates the transcendence. It's jumping, it's beyond. And yet, even though it's beyond, it still distinguishes between Jew and no Jew. This is the great miracle and revelation of the Pesach. And that's what's referred to as jumping over. Not because God's literally jumping over anything. God doesn't jump over stuff, right? But it's symbolic of this notion that the divine transcends, and yet, even though God transcends, he chooses to distinguish between holy and unholy, between Jew and non-Jew. Because logically speaking, the transcendent should not care between Jew and non-Jew. It's transcendent. What's the difference? All the same. And yet God says, no. Jew, yes. Non-Jew, no. And this is expressed in the verse, which reads, Haloi ach Esav Yaakov. Is Yaakov not a brother to Esav? Is Esav not a brother to Yaakov? As if to say they're both the same. But the verse concludes, as Yaakov Aheva, but I love Yaakov. Notwithstanding the fact that they're brothers, notwithstanding the fact that they're equal in my eyes as far as the transcendence is concerned, God says, I choose the Jew. That's expressed in this Pesach idea, and that's really the essence of the whole story of the Exodus from Egypt. Lakachas like goy mikerev goy. God takes one nation out of another nation. That's what the verse describes the Jewish people being taken out of Egypt.
Selection.
It's a selection. Even though it's goy mikerev goy, it's one nation, another nation. What's the difference? But God says, no, I'm choosing one from the other. That's the essence of the story of Passover. And it's expressed actually in the spiritual shame to glory story. The shame to glory story and the spiritual one, right? There's two shame to glory stories. One is Egypt to slavery to freedom, physical, and the other one is spiritual. We were idol worshippers, and now, as the Rambam puts it, you brought us close to your worship. You chose us not randomly, by your choice. You decided to pick us out and bring us close to you. Even though, as far as the transcendence is concerned, well, what's the difference? No, God said, I choose you. And that's the idea of God jumping over. Okay, so a little chassidus thrown in there for today. Okay, God willing, tomorrow we get to more texts that the Mishnah tells us to read as we conclude the recitation of the story and merge into the beginning of the Hallel. Yeah.
How do you fulfill that mitzvah reciting giving the information? Is it by saying those three words, or is it by explaining?
So Rashbam says, Peter's time one, explain their reasons. Which is why the Mishnah gives us this.
Interesting why it's broken up into different pieces. You say these three words, and then you go into
explaining. Well, it says if you don't cover these three, if you don't explain these three things, you won't fulfill your obligation. And then it gives the explanation of these three things. Yeah. You want to pass me the booklet from the Haggadah there a second? Yeah, thank you. We missed. Okay, we'll get to it the next time because I guess it's relevant then also. Because I thought you were going to ask something else, which is, if you say the words in Hebrew and don't understand it, did you even fulfill your obligation here? Because you are correct, you should understand it. And we're going to see in a minute We're going to see, God willing, when we get to the Pesach commentary on this next section. I thought we were going to do it now, but it's not here. But we'll get to it when we look at the next section of the Pesach Haggadah, commenting on the necessity to understand at least certain elements of the Haggadah. Otherwise,
If you left my question,
you
then
need to fulfill your
further,
obligation. Because the point is you understand these things. If you don't understand them, what are you doing?
further,
Especially when it comes to answering the question, which is why I wanted to be here. Because when you're answering the question, the Mishnah said, the feedback to show ben of a malamdai. Based on the child's knowledge, the father explains it to him. Which means the child has some knowledge of what you're saying to him, otherwise, what are you doing? Okay, we're going to get to that, God willing, in the next comment from the Pesach Haggadah. It should have been earlier, but I don't know why I forgot to print it in this packet here. Yeah,
thank you.
what were we going to say? Sorry.
I'm not saying, what if you skipped reciting the 3 words and you just went into the explanation?
That would have been enough.
That'd be good enough?
Yeah, on the basic level, yes.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful day, Eden.